Mark Bannerman reporting there. Well, now, wealth and poverty. No one doubts that in modern Australia the rich are getting richer, but an argument is raging today about whether the poor are getting poorer. Last November, the private charity, the Smith family, published a report which claimed that during the booming 1990s, the number of Australians living below the poverty line had actually increased. But now the Centre for Independent Studies is challenging those figures. By drawing the poverty line too high, claims the CIS, the Smith family has exaggerated the problem of poverty. In fact, it says the poor, as well as the rich, got richer in the 90s. Well, who's right, and why does it matter? In a minute, I'll be talking to the main authors of both reports, but first, a brief recap of Rebecca Bailey's report on the Smith family study last November.
Russell Johnson is 31, single and unemployed. He lost his job 3 weeks ago. Now he's been evicted from his flat and is staying with his mother.
I'm living in poverty. I'm living in extreme poverty. I've gone from being a working class person to, well, at the moment I'm on a lounge, but tomorrow I'll probably be living on the streets.
One of the most worrying findings was that despite a decade of very strong economic growth, we lost ground in the battle against poverty over the past 10 years. This is looking at the main income source of those families who are in poverty.
The Smith family commissioned Professor Anne Harding to investigate poverty trends over the past decade. She concluded that not only had the number of people living in poverty increased, but the face of poverty is changing.
What happened over the course of the 1990s was there were huge shifts in the labour market, the manufacturing industries closed down, and the unemployment rates of men for the first time started to be higher than those of women. And so what we saw was the rise of a very large number of single, poor, working-age men.
I want to have a good look at and detail at the report, as I say, it's a relative measure when you consider that under the previous government the low income earners had a fall in their real earnings, whereas under this government they've had an increase in their real wages.
Federal Family and Community Services Minister Amanda Vanstone argues the report's definition of poverty at 50% of average weekly earnings should be taken with a grain of salt.
It depends what you take as a poverty measure, and provided you understand what that measure is. If someone says there are simply more numbers of people below the average 50% of average earnings, but fails to mention that average earnings have gone up and those people are in real terms, in real dollar terms, better off, then I think that's mistaken. If, however, it's clear what's being discussed, then it's great.
And that's basically the point made in more detail today by the Centre for Independent Studies. The Smith family study says people are poor if they earn half the average income, which they calculate by adding all Australian incomes together and dividing the total by the number of earners. But the CIS says that a few very wealthy people distort that figure. It's more realistic, they say, to take the median income, which is what you'd earn if 50% of the population earns more than you and 50% earns less. Halving that figure produces a significantly lower poverty line. Well, a short while ago I spoke to Anne Harding of the University of Canberra, who was the principal author of the Smith family's report, and with Dr. Peter Saunders of the Centre for Independent Studies. Peter Saunders, you seem to be essentially agreeing with what Senator Amanda Vanstone says, and that is that it depends what you take as a poverty measure. So what's been your argument?
Well, we essentially take issue with what I think were the two key points to come out of the Smith family report in November. One of those, they're the 2 points that the media picked up on at the time. One is the claim that as many as 1 in 8 Australians today are in poverty, and we think that that's an overestimate. The second is the claim that poverty's actually got worse through the 1990s. And that, on the face of it, is an extraordinary claim when you look at how the economy's been going in the 1990s. So we take issue with that too. We think both of those claims are actually misleading.
And in fact, your conclusion was that something like it's, 1 in 12, 1 in 13. What was the measure you used?
Well, we're using the same material out of the same reports. We haven't done our own research. We're looking in more detail at what the Smith family's research actually showed. Now, what it shows is, first of all, one of the key things is it shows that even the poorest people in this country increased their real incomes, that's controlling for inflation, by $38 a week on average, each person. So between 1990 and 2000. The second point is that what the Smith family's done, what Anne Harding has done on behalf of the Smith family, is to say, well, OK, that's true in absolute terms, but poverty is really about relative measures. But the relative measure they've taken, I think, is one that's actually quite unusual and which is particularly susceptible to extreme extreme cases at each end of the income distribution. Now, that becomes important when you look at what happened to incomes in Australia in the 1990s. What the report shows is that poor people, those at the bottom of the distribution, got better off on average by $38 a week. Those in the middle of the distribution got better on average by about the same amount. Those at the very top, the top 5% of earners, increased their earnings a lot more than that. Now, that has pulled the average earnings up. And because the Smith family defines poverty on the basis of average earnings, it's pulled the poverty line up. So essentially, and it's a technical argument, but essentially what it means is that what they're getting hold of is the idea that people at the top got better off, and they're interpreting that as saying that people at the bottom therefore got worse off, and they didn't. We all got better off.
Okay.
It's just those at the top got even better.
Anne Harding, if I could ask you to address that point that in fact the Smith family has ended up overstating the extent of poverty because of what Peter Saunders has just said then, that you've taken the poverty line at half the average of the income of all Australians, not half of the mean.
Peter is saying he prefers the half-middle Australian income measure, and what that excludes is the top half of all Australians. The Smith family preferred a poverty measure that included all Australians within its ambit, both those at the top but also those in the top half of the distribution.
Well, no, it preferred it, but is it accurate?
Well, there is no benchmark here or overseas that says what is the most accurate measure. There's no consensus, and that's why a range of measures were presented in the report.
Peter Saunders?
Well, Anne's right that there's a range of different measures. What we're doing is saying, first of all, that most of the poverty research that's done in the Western world nowadays is based on a figure of half the median, half the middle income, not half the mean, precisely because of this problem of the measure being distorted by high incomes. Across the Western world, the top incomes have been getting a lot higher over the last 10 years. As a result of the kind of economic and technical changes that are going on. That, across the Western world, will always produce a result that says that poverty is therefore getting worse if you're going to measure poverty on the basis of averages. That's why most poverty researchers are not doing that anymore.
Anne Harding, could I get you to address that point?
Yes. First, I want to say that it's not true that overseas everybody is setting the poverty line at half of median income. So in some cases in Eurostat, for example, it's 60% of the median, and other people use half the average because they worry that if you pick the median, you do exclude the top half of the population, and that's a very important half to consider.
Can I broaden this just a bit, perhaps to you, Peter Saunders, first? I'm just wondering where this sort of debate gets us, because if you are living on, say, $350 or $400 a week, that's pretty tight. It's not a way of being able to express much ambition in your life, is it?
No, it's not, and I'm not denying that there are people out there who are experiencing hardship. Of course there are. I think what we're really saying is the key problem of poverty is those people who are in long-term poverty. And again, one of the problems with the Smith family report is that it takes a snapshot of 1 week. What people report in 1 week. What we know is that over time, a lot of people who fall under a poverty line this year will be above it next year. In Britain, research on following the same people through over a period of years found 40% of those who were under the poverty line this year were out of it the next year. So, of course, I've been under the poverty line myself. You probably have too. People during the course of their lives, their incomes dip, when they're students or when they're between jobs and so on. That isn't really the problem. The problem is long-term sustained deprivation. Now, that, I don't think the Smith family report begins to give us a decent estimate on. It certainly isn't 1 in 8. I don't think it's even 1 in 12. I think it's probably closer to something like 1 in 20. Now, the reason why this debate's important is that if it's something like 1 in 20, and we know from this report and from other reports that the main cause of poverty is lack of work. The main reason why people are falling below these poverty lines is that they're not earning full time. Now, if we're talking about, say, 1 in 20, that's a targetable problem that we can learn from what's gone on in America, what's gone on in Europe, and indeed some of the debates that are happening here in Australia about ways of getting those people back into the workforce. And we can start talking about maybe even eradicating poverty. But if the Smith family's right, which I don't think they are, that this is a problem affecting 1 in 8 Australians, then we've got a huge, major problem on our hands, and I wouldn't know how to begin to tackle it, except that you're going to start talking about increasing welfare benefits, which we can't afford to do, which we know have disincentive effects, which are actually going to keep people out of the labour market rather than draw them in, and we're going to go off down the wrong track altogether.
And Harding, do you think that figure of 1 in 20 could be right? And I suppose one would have to say, if that's right, why are organisations like the Smith family and other charities reporting an increase on their services, not a decrease?
Well, we have no longitudinal data in Australia that follows the same people over time at this point, and so we have no idea in Australia at the moment how long people do stay in poverty. But I think one of the most startling findings of the report for me was that 6 in every 10 unemployed people were in poverty. And so it's fairly clear that if you're an unemployed breadwinner with a spouse at home and a couple of children, if you don't get a job, then you will stay in poverty for a long period of time. And so it does point fairly clearly to one area where we're now treating the unemployed very harshly and producing high poverty rates amongst that group.
And yet Peter Saunders has just said quite starkly that in fact, he's painted a dramatically different picture from the one that you are.
Well, it depends whether you think we're only worried about people who are poor for 5 years or longer, or whether we are worried about people who are poor for a year. I mean, a year is not a short period of time, is it?
Anne Harding, Peter Saunders, we have to end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A debate I suspect that has a bit of time to run yet.